Hollywood loves to shove the same dusty westerns in your face until your eyes glaze over. High Noon, The Searcher's Shane. Sure, they're iconic, but let's be honest, there's a whole frontier of westerns that barely get whispered about. These aren't the usual cowboy bedtime stories. They're rougher, stranger, and in many ways, more honest. So here's the real question. How many treasures have you been missing while rewatching the same 5 titles? Saddle up, because the hidden guns are about to come out. Monty Walsh, 1970. How do you make a western about the end of the West itself? You strip away the myths, the heroics, and the cheap thrills, and you get Monty Walsh. Released in 1970, this isn't about shootouts and gold. It's about cowboys who are outliving their own legend. Lee Marvin plays Monty, a ranch hand who suddenly realizes the world doesn't need men like him anymore. The railroads, barbed wire, and progress are closing in. The Wild West is dying, and so are its drifters. What sets Monty Walsh apart is its honesty. Instead of glorifying gunfights, it gives you the day-to-day grind, the back-breaking work, the loneliness, the sense of becoming obsolete. Jack Palance, playing Monty's best friend, delivers one of his most underrated performances as a man torn between settling down and staying wild. The film's biggest power lies in its mood. It's elegiac, like a sunset over an empty prairie, beautiful and tragic at the same time. Director William A. Fraker doesn't push for melodrama. He lets silence, long stares, and the harsh landscape do the talking. The little details, the worn saddles, the weary eyes of men who've seen too much, hit harder than any gunshot. Monty Walsh is less about action and more about reflection. And that's what makes it unforgettable. If you want a western that feels like a final goodbye to an era, this is the one that lingers long after the credits. It's not the cowboy you cheer for, it's the cowboy you mourn. Ride with the Devil, 1999. Forget polished gunfighters under a blazing sun. Ride with the Devil throws you into the mud, the shadows, and the terrifying chaos of the Civil War. Directed by Ang Lee, yes, the same man behind Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. This is no traditional western. It's a war western, and it's as unpredictable as the frontier itself. The story follows a group of bushwhackers, Confederate guerrillas, fighting a ruthless, lawless war in Missouri. Tobey Maguire plays Jake Rodel, a young man pulled into violence he barely understands. Alongside him is Skeet Ulrich. And, in a surprisingly raw role, a then up-and-coming singer, Jewel. But the breakout is Jeffrey Wright as Daniel Holt, a freed slave fighting for the South. His presence alone complicates every assumption you thought you had about loyalty, freedom, and identity in the Old West. What makes Ride with the Devil special is its refusal to play nice with history. This isn't a glossy good guys versus bad guys tale. It's about the gray, the mud, the moral confusion of a war where nobody is really innocent. Ang Lee's direction captures every detail. The forests lit like Gothic paintings, the sudden bursts of gunfire in the night, the quiet moments of men who know death is waiting around the corner. The film bombed at the box office, overshadowed by bigger hits. But rewatch it now, and it's clear. Ride with the Devil is one of the boldest Civil War westerns ever made. It's messy, human, and unforgettable. If you want a film that throws you headfirst into the storm instead of holding your hand, this is it. McCabe and Mrs. Miller, 1971. What happens when a western feels less like a legend and more like a dream slipping through your fingers? You get Robert Altman's McCabe and Mrs. Miller, one of the most hypnotic films the genre has ever produced. Starring Warren Beatty and Julie Christie, it's a love story, a business venture, and a funeral dirge, all rolled into one. Beatty plays John McCabe, a gambler who drifts into a snowy frontier town with big plans. He teams up with Mrs. Miller, a pragmatic, sharp-eyed madam, played with quiet brilliance by Christie. Together, they build a booming business. But this isn't a story about triumph. It's about inevitability. The powerful mining companies want the land, and when they don't get it, the guns come out. Altman's touch makes the movie unforgettable. The cinematography is deliberately soft, hazy, like memory itself. Leonard Cohen's songs float over the film like ghostly prayers, turning every snowbound scene into something haunting. McCabe is no gunslinger, no legend, just a flawed man in way over his head. Mrs. Miller is more grounded, smarter, but trapped by her own limitations. The final showdown doesn't play out like a heroic duel. It's cold, messy, and inevitable, just like real violence. Critics didn't know what to do with it in 1971, but today it's recognized as one of the greatest anti-westerns ever made. McCabe and Mrs. Miller isn't about celebrating the frontier. It's about showing how fragile and doomed it really was. If you want a western that feels like it's drifting into smoke, this one will haunt you long after it ends. The Oxbow Incident, 1943. Want to see the western stripped of glamour, gunfights, and glory? The Oxbow Incident does exactly that. Released in 1943, it's not about cattle rustlers or bandits. It's about mob justice and how quickly ordinary people turn into monsters when fear takes over. Henry Fonda leads the cast as a drifter who gets caught up in a posse out for blood. A rancher's been killed, and the townsfolk want revenge. They track down 3 men they believe are guilty. No trial, no evidence, just ropes and rage. The brilliance of the Oxbow Incident lies in its suffocating tension. Almost the entire film takes place in one night, under a looming sense of dread. The accused men plead for their lives. One writes a heartbreaking letter to his wife and children, begging them to remember him kindly. The mob doesn't care. They're hungry for justice, or at least the illusion of it. Watching it unfold feels like watching a slow-motion car crash. You can't look away, even though you know it's headed for disaster. At the time, the film was too bleak for audiences looking for wartime escapism. But now, it's hailed as a masterpiece. No sweeping vistas, no heroic standoffs, just raw human ugliness laid bare. The message hits harder than any bullet. The real danger in the West wasn't always outlaws. Sometimes it was the neighbors standing right beside you. The Oxbow Incident is proof that a Western doesn't need guns blazing to leave you shaken. It just needs the truth. Heaven's Gate, 1980. Some call it the biggest disaster in Hollywood history. Others call it one of the most ambitious Westerns ever made. Heaven's Gate is both, and that's what makes it so fascinating. Directed by Michael Cimino, fresh off his Oscar-winning triumph, The Deer Hunter, this 3.5-hour epic nearly bankrupted United Artists. But strip away the scandal, and what you're left with is a Western of staggering beauty and fury. The story is based on the real Johnson County War, where rich cattle barons hired mercenaries to wipe out immigrant settlers in Wyoming. Chris Christopherson plays a weary marshal caught between the ruthless elite and the struggling farmers. Christopher Walken is unforgettable as a hired killer torn between his duty and his conscience. Add in Isabel Huppert, radiant and tragic, and you've got a triangle of doomed lives in a world spinning out of control. Cimino's obsession with detail is legendary. He rebuilt entire towns, choreographed battles like operas, and filmed scenes over and over until perfection bled through. The result? Sweeping landscapes that look like oil paintings, battle sequences that hit with brutal force, and quiet, tender moments that make the violence sting even more. Yes, critics tore it apart in 1980. Yes, the studio collapsed under the weight of its failure. But decades later, Heaven's Gate has been reevaluated as a flawed masterpiece. It's messy, indulgent, and overwhelming, but also unforgettable. If you've ever wanted a Western that feels less like entertainment and more like living history carved into film, Heaven's Gate is the ride you'll never forget. Open Range, 2003. By the early 2000s, most people thought the classic Western was finished. Then Kevin Costner rode back in with Open Range, a film that doesn't just revive the genre, it slaps the dust off it and reminds everyone why it mattered. Costner directs and stars as Charlie Waite, a quiet man with a violent past, working alongside Robert Duvall's boss Spearman as free-grazing cattlemen. They clash with a ruthless land baron and his hired guns, leading to one of the most breathtaking showdowns ever filmed. What makes Open Range stand out is its patience. Costner doesn't rush. He lets the audience live in the wide open spaces, the long silences, and the moments of reflection. The bond between Costner and Duvall feels lived in, full of unspoken history. And when the violence finally erupts, it isn't romanticized. It's brutal, chaotic, and loud. The gunfire echoes like thunder, leaving you rattled in your seat. Annette Bening adds depth as a frontier woman who sees through Charlie's haunted eyes, giving the film a surprising tenderness. But make no mistake, this is a story about men coming to terms with the cost of survival in a world that doesn't forgive weakness. Costner, often criticized for being too earnest, delivers a performance here that's weary, understated, and powerful. Open Range didn't try to reinvent the wheel, it polished it until it gleamed. It's as traditional as they come, but told with so much care and craft that it feels fresh. By the end, when the smoke clears, you realize you've witnessed a modern classic. If you thought the Western was dead at the turn of the century, Open Range proved it still had bullets left in the chamber. The Shooting, 1966. Most Westerns follow a simple path: hero, villain, showdown. The Shooting laughs at that idea and instead gives you something closer to a nightmare. Directed by Monty Hellman and starring Warren Oates, Jack Nicholson, and Millie Perkins, this is one of the strangest, most unsettling Westerns ever made. The story begins simply enough. A drifter and two companions set out across the desert to track someone down. But the further they travel, the less sense anything makes. Millie Perkins plays a mysterious woman with unclear motives. Nicholson, sharp and menacing, is a hired gun who might be the devil himself. Warren Oates, as always, grounds the madness with his everyman grit. What makes The Shooting legendary is what it refuses to explain. Every scene drips with tension. Every interaction feels like a puzzle piece that doesn't quite fit. The desert itself becomes a character, endless, empty, suffocating. You never know who's leading who, or if they're all just walking into doom. By the time the film reaches its haunting finale, you're left with more questions than answers. Hellman shot this back-to-back with Ride in the Whirlwind, both on tiny budgets, and together they practically invented the acid western, movies that take the tropes of the genre and twist them until they feel surreal. The Shooting never got wide release, which only added to its cult mystique. Today, it's regarded as one of the boldest Western experiments ever made. If you want gunfights and easy heroes, look elsewhere. But if you want a Western that creeps under your skin and stays there like a desert mirage you can't shake, The Shooting is waiting for you. Just don't expect any answers. The Long Riders, 1980. What if you cast real-life brothers to play the most infamous outlaw brothers of the West? That's the genius of The Long Riders, directed by Walter Hill. The James Younger gang gets the star treatment here, with the Carradine brothers, the Quaid brothers, the Keach brothers, and even the Guest brothers all stepping into history. The result is a film that feels startlingly authentic, like you're watching real bloodlines ride into danger. The story covers the gang's rise and fall, but it's not just about robberies. It's about loyalty, family, and the inevitable price of living outside the law. David Carradine delivers one of his best performances as Cole Younger, while James Keach plays Jesse James with a cold charisma that's hard to look away from. Walter Hill, a master of tough, stripped-down storytelling, brings his signature grit to the genre. The action scenes are tight, brutal, and realistic, none more so than the legendary Northfield raid. Shot in slow motion, with bodies crashing through glass and bullets ripping through the air, it's one of the most jaw-dropping action sequences in Western history. But what gives The Long Riders its soul is the family dynamic. These aren't just outlaws, they're brothers bound by blood and bad choices. Watching them fall apart is as tragic as it is inevitable. Hill doesn't romanticize them, but he doesn't demonize them either. He just lets the story play out, and the result is raw, unforgettable. The Long Riders never became a massive hit, but it's quietly one of the finest outlaw westerns ever made. If you want action with emotional punch, this film delivers both barrels. Appaloosa, 2008. By 2008, the Western was a rare breed in Hollywood. Then Ed Harris saddled up with Appaloosa, proving the genre still had a place on the big screen. Harris directs and stars alongside Viggo Mortensen, and together they craft a story less about guns and more about friendship, loyalty, and the messy rules of frontier justice. The setup feels classic. Two hired lawmen arrive in a town terrorized by a ruthless rancher, played with icy menace by Jeremy Irons. But Appaloosa doesn't play it simple. The real core of the film is the bond between Harris's stoic Virgil Cole and Mortensen's sharp-shooting Everett Hitch. Their quiet camaraderie gives the story its weight, showing how trust and respect meant everything in a world where a bullet could end you any second. Renee Zellweger stirs the pot as a widow whose presence complicates everything. The love triangle that develops doesn't feel tacked on. It deepens the characters, exposing flaws and vulnerabilities. Harris's direction keeps things steady and intimate, letting the performances breathe instead of hiding behind spectacle. When the action does hit, it's quick, sharp, and shockingly realistic. Gunfights aren't drawn-out dances. They're sudden, brutal bursts. The film's pacing mirrors the life it portrays, long stretches of waiting, moments of laughter, and then violence that changes everything in an instant. Appaloosa didn't make a huge cultural splash, but for those who saw it, it struck gold. It's a Western made with care, intelligence, and respect for the genre's roots. If you want to see a story about friendship tested by fire, Appaloosa deserves your full attention. Ulzana's Raid, 1972. Ulzana's Raid isn't your typical Western. It's harsh, uncomfortable, and refuses to sugarcoat the brutality of the frontier. Directed by Robert Aldrich, it stars Burt Lancaster as a weary Army scout brought in to track down an Apache leader, Ulzana, who has escaped the reservation with a band of warriors. What follows is less an adventure than a descent into the grim realities of cultural conflict and survival. The film doesn't shy away from the horrors of war. Every attack by Ulzana's band leaves behind devastation, and the cavalry is often just as ruthless in response. The young officer leading the mission believes in fairness and decency, but he quickly learns the West doesn't operate on ideals. It operates on survival. Lancaster's character, hardened and pragmatic, becomes the bitter voice of reality, clashing with the officer's naive sense of justice. What makes Ulzana's Raid so powerful is its refusal to paint heroes and villains in black and white. The violence is shocking, the morality is murky, and the lessons are brutal. It's one of the rare Westerns that looks the audience in the eye and says, "This is what the frontier really cost." The performances are raw, the desert landscapes unforgiving, and the tension never lets up. Critics at the time were divided. Some found it too grim, others hailed it as a masterpiece. Today, it stands tall as one of the most honest depictions of frontier warfare ever filmed. Ulzana's Raid isn't easy to watch, but that's the point. It's a Western that burns away the myths and leaves you with the harsh, ugly truth. If you can handle it, you'll never forget it. Tom Horn, 1980. If you want to watch a legend fade out in real time, Tom Horn is the Western you need. Steve McQueen, in one of his final roles, plays the real-life scout and gunman who lived by the gun long after the frontier was vanishing. This isn't the McQueen of car chases and cool shades. This is a weary, doomed man stumbling toward the end of his story. Tom Horn starts with promise. Hired by cattle barons to stop rustlers, Horn does his job a little too well. He's efficient, ruthless, and terrifyingly good at what he does. But times are changing. The same men who hire him soon turn on him when his brand of justice feels too messy for polite society. A trumped-up murder charge seals his fate, and the film follows his slow, inevitable walk to the gallows. McQueen was battling illness during filming, and it shows in his performance. Every glance, every movement carries weight. He looks like a man running out of time, which mirrors Horn's own story perfectly. There's no glamour here, no triumphant last ride, just a man realizing he's become obsolete. The film itself is stripped down, quiet, almost mournful. The landscapes are wide and beautiful, but they feel like backdrops for a funeral. It's a tragic tale, but one told with honesty. For McQueen, it became a haunting swan song, a reminder that even the toughest gunslingers can't outrun history. Tom Horn is underrated because it's not flashy. But sometimes the most powerful westerns aren't about victory. They're about endings. And this one lingers long after the final frame. Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, 1973. Most westerns would have you believe Billy the Kid went down in a blaze of glory. Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid has no interest in easy myths. Directed by Sam Peckinpah, the master of blood and dust, this film is about betrayal, inevitability, and the slow death of legends. James Coburn plays Pat Garrett, once Billy's friend, now his hunter. Chris Christopherson is Billy, reckless, charming, and doomed. Their cat-and-mouse chase isn't about justice, it's about survival in a world where even outlaws can't escape progress. Peckinpah paints the story not as a ballad of good and evil, but as a dirge for the West itself. The violence is raw, messy, and unforgettable, but it's the atmosphere that makes the film iconic. Peckinpah shoots the West as a place rotting from within, where loyalty means nothing and everyone sells out eventually. Bob Dylan, yes, that Bob Dylan, even shows up in a small role and provides a haunting soundtrack that feels like the ghost of America singing over its own funeral. At the time, the studio butchered Peckinpah's vision, cutting it down and confusing audiences. Critics dismissed it as another violent Western. But the director's cut revealed a masterpiece, bleak, poetic, and devastating. Today, it's recognized as one of Peckinpah's best, a film that doesn't just tell a story, but captures the exact moment when the Wild West finally died. If you want a Western that trades in grit instead of glory, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid delivers. It's less about who wins and more about the cost of playing the game. And by the end, nobody comes out clean. Jeremiah Johnson, 1972. Forget the saloons and dusty main streets. Jeremiah Johnson takes you into the mountains, where survival is the only law. Robert Redford stars as a Mexican war veteran who turns his back on society and tries to live as a mountain man in the Rockies. What follows isn't a celebration of freedom. It's a brutal reminder of how merciless the wilderness can be. The film begins quietly, with Johnson learning the basics of survival. He builds, he hunts, he struggles. Slowly, he adapts. But the mountain doesn't forgive mistakes, and neither do the people who live there. Johnson clashes with native tribes, loses those closest to him, and finds himself hunted by enemies he never intended to make. Director Sidney Pollack doesn't romanticize the story. The landscapes are breathtaking, snow-capped peaks, endless forests, but they're also unforgiving. Redford's performance is stripped bare of glamour. He's quiet, weary, and hardened by loss. By the time he becomes a legend whispered about in the valleys, you realize the legend came at the cost of everything human he once had. Jeremiah Johnson was a hit when it came out, but over time it's been overshadowed by flashier westerns. That's a shame, because it's one of the most haunting depictions of isolation and survival ever filmed. It's not about gunfights. It's about endurance, grief, and the price of solitude. If you want a Western where the real enemy isn't a gunslinger, but nature itself, Jeremiah Johnson will leave you shivering long after the credits. Will Penny, 1967. Charlton Heston as a cowboy past his prime. That's not the kind of casting you expect, but in Will Penny, it works brilliantly. This isn't Heston, the heroic figure leading armies. This is Heston as a tired, lonely ranch hand, just trying to get by in a world that's already forgotten him. The story is deceptively simple. Will Penny takes a winter job on a remote ranch, only to stumble across a widow and her son hiding out. Against his better judgment, he helps them, and for the first time in his life, he gets a taste of what a family might feel like. But this being the West, happiness doesn't come easy. The threat of violence looms, and Will knows he can't stay forever. What makes the film remarkable is its refusal to glamorize the cowboy life. Will Penny isn't rich, he isn't heroic, and he isn't going to ride into the sunset with a big grin. He's a man who's worked his body into the ground for pennies, with nothing to show for it except calloused hands and worn-out boots. The romance in the film is tender, but it's tinged with sadness. because we know from the start that it can't last. Heston gives one of the most vulnerable performances of his career, far from his usual larger-than-life roles. Joan Hackett, as the widow, matches him with warmth and strength. Together, they create a chemistry that feels painfully real. Will Penny isn't flashy, but that's exactly why it works. It's a Western that looks the myth in the eye and says, "This is what being a cowboy really costs." And the truth hurts. The Gray Fox, 1982. Most Westerns end with the gunslinger riding off into legend. The Gray Fox asks, what happens if he survives long enough to outlive the legend? Richard Farnsworth delivers a career-defining performance as Bill Miner, a real-life stagecoach robber who gets out of prison after decades and discovers a world he barely recognizes. Set at the turn of the century, the film follows Miner as he tries to adapt to modern life. Automobiles are replacing horses, cities are booming, and the old frontier ways are vanishing fast. But Miner can't shake who he is. After watching the early silent film The Great Train Robbery, he's inspired to take up his old trade one last time, this time robbing trains instead of coaches. What makes The Gray Fox unforgettable is its quiet charm. Farnsworth, with his gentle voice and weary eyes, turns Miner into a folk hero you can't help but root for, even as you know his choices will lead him back into trouble. The film doesn't glorify crime. It celebrates resilience, adaptability, and the stubbornness of a man who refuses to be erased by time. The cinematography captures the wide, changing landscapes of the American West as it slips into modernity. There's a bittersweet beauty in watching Miner ride again, knowing he belongs to a past that no longer exists. The Gray Fox didn't make huge waves on release, but critics adored it, and over time it has become a quiet classic. It's less about gunfights and more about dignity, about how a man faces the end of an era with grace. If you want a Western that feels like a gentle farewell, The Gray Fox is the one to watch. So there you have it, 15 Westerns that Hollywood buried under dust while the same old classics hog the spotlight. These films don't just replay the myths, they rip them open, question them, and show the West for what it really was: harsh, messy, and unforgettable. Which one just jumped to the top of your must-watch list? Drop it in the comments. Share this with a friend who thinks they've seen every Western, and don't forget to subscribe. The frontier isn't finished surprising you. Are you ready for the next ride?